Welcome once again to the EPS podcast where everything is a primary source. I am Eric Paul, and so far I've actually forgot to plug my website. It's epspodcast.club. I assume that means like a club as in a place that people meet, not like a caveman's club, because that doesn't seem very digital and modern. So epspodcast.club, where you'll see the latest episodes as well as contact information if you have any ideas of what we should do. Myself, guest commentator for a primary source. Today, my guest is Adi Rule, who is the author of several books and has a website of her own. How are we doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm here with my cats and my Garfield collection, which we will not be talking about.
Right, but we were going to, and it was so silly because I was all set to talk all things Garfield, and that would be the cat, the cartoon cat, not President James Garfield, which I kind of was wondering. I'm like, are most of the quotes from Garfield actually James Garfield quotes that Jim Davis just kind of, put onto his cartoon?
Would be interesting.
Like big lasagna lover.
But we should look into that. I know James Garfield's granddaughter, actually.
Oh, really?
With my mom. Yeah.
That's so funny.
There's a whole crossover episode right there.
Yeah, I think we will have to do this after the holiday season, because I realized looking at the calendar, as if the other signs didn't tell me, it's, we're approaching Christmas. And so I was like, well, even though people can listen to this any time of the year that they want, why not do something over the next couple of weeks that are all related to the holidays? So I suggested something that to me means Christmas is coming and the goose is getting fat, and that would be the John Denver and the Muppets, A Christmas Together. When I posed this idea to you, what did you say?
I said, I turned on caps lock and I said, OMG, that is my favorite album.
Why is it your favorite? It's one of mine too, but I just want to hear from you. What makes it so good?
To me, this album is Christmas. When I hear this album, I am transported back to that dark, warm, cozy 1980s, zero technology except for that ancient television with the knobs kind of house and the tree with the Christmas lights. And it still takes me back there. I still listen to it every year. And I love that when we signed on, you held up your copy, your record copy, and I held up mine, and we both...
They were just looking at each other. They were matching each other up. It's funny because I'm exactly the same way, and I'm sure there's countless other people our age that grew up in the 80s and had this as part of their cycle. And I have a distinct memory of this being played when we were decorating the tree one year, and we lived on an Air Force base, and so it was, I remember it vividly. There was like the base fire department came around with Santa Claus on the back of one of their fire trucks. It wasn't like a real parade. It was just them coming around and saying to all the neighborhoods on the base. And so this album was playing, and then somebody's like, Santa Claus, and so we went to the door, and I could still see the door so perfectly. We lived in one of those it was like 4 family homes, like we had different houses, but like this big building divided into four houses, and looking through the little window, which was crowded by those really like fat Christmas bulbs, and just seeing through it and seeing the lights reflecting off of everything. And I'm like, oh, and it brings me right back. And we were talking because, one of the questions on this, when we analyze the primary source, we're using this record as a primary source. Why was it made? And, one reason was to support the Christmas special, the TV Christmas special that neither of us have seen.
I guess in part of my brain, I must have known that there probably was a Christmas special to go along with this, but I never saw it. I don't remember it being on TV or anything like that.
when looking it up, I learned that this came out on, it was aired in December 5th, 1979, was when the television special was.
Okay.
And it the record, the soundtrack companion actually came out 2 months before. It came out in October of
Oh,
the
good.
same year to try to,
That was
you know,
smart of
I
them.
I get, yeah, to get ahead of it a little bit,
Keep it hyped
assuming
up.
that, you know, that people would like the show. And but I think that for most of us, it's completely because the TV show came out before VHS had really taken off. And so they never made a VHS out of it. If it was made 5 years later, you're guaranteed that
Hmm.
they would have aired it on ABC, and then immediately, you know, you'd probably go to the store the next day and start seeing, you know, the actual VHS copy of it.
Yeah.
But since they didn't do that, the only thing that we have left over is this record. And so there it is. So
Hmm.
um and for me, whenever I hear it, I love the artwork on this. I think it's just fantastic. I
Oh,
love
yeah.
the black background, the those rich, you know, colors with the you know, bright colors with the contrast. The when
The
you
big
open it up,
of all the Muppets, like if you open it up on the back, you
yeah,
can see the whole group of them. And on the
it's
inside, you've got all this sheet music that seems like they were just sitting around the piano playing
yeah,
these.
and great, you know, just great artwork as far as, you know, design, making
Mhm.
each one of those look like sheet music. And you could buy sheet music, but it came all together. It wasn't individualized like this. You know, after this came out, and that's something else that we can discuss as well. But whenever I hear any song from this album, I picture it as in like the actual cover art. I picture them in like a black
Yeah,
studio or just like a black
totally.
area, and like and I always have, like, whenever, ever since, like the theater of the mind kind of thing, you know, it's like it's all there. So the first question, and we could bounce around, but I think, you know, when we work with this, you know, the first question is, what material is this made from, and or how is it made? And, you know, the actual physical material itself of the um you know, the cover and you know, we're talking about cardboard and we're talking about vinyl, but when it comes to the actual, you know, unable to be touched material, we're talking about the Muppets, and we're talking
Sure.
about John Denver, and we're talking about Christmas standards as well as new songs.
Hmm.
So, which of those should we discuss first? What are your uh, understandings about John Denver and his musical career up until about 1979?
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on the arc of John Denver's
Well, sign
career.
off right now, then we're done.
But I know he was a staple in my household, which was, even though I grew up in the 80s, it was essentially a 70s household, right? I mean, we had that holdover what our parents were listening to. And John Denver was iconic in his day in the 70s, and had just hit upon hit upon hit. He wrote something like 200 or 300 songs or something like that. I mean, I looked him up very briefly just to
Yeah.
see how prolific he was. And the Muppets were iconic at that time as well. And so it was like this meeting of these major pop culture institutions, and it was pretty exciting.
I don't think either of them get the credit, especially in the present day, or even just a couple of years ago, of being as experimental and
Mm.
as artistic as they were. I
Hmm.
think a lot of people just kind of judge John Denver, maybe even based on this album and its cover, as being, you know, easy listening type guy, you know, just always in the background when you're at the clothing store, you know, just kind of like hearing John Denver music, or, you know, part of a, you know, a commercial or something like that. But I remember my parents telling me about a concert that they went to of his in the 70s, and they were just like blown away
Yeah.
by, you know, the way it was performed and stuff. And the Muppets, you know, and Jim Henson, again, that's another property that I think a lot of people write off,
Yeah.
and perhaps rightly so now, as being overdone, just popping up everywhere. It's like, when all else fails, if you want to get a quick laugh from somebody, throw them up it in there.
Yeah.
Like a Weezer video, or um, I was watching something last night. I just kind of came across on YouTube. It was from about 8 years ago, and it was a big. It was promoting their latest movie at the time, and it was just like this cook-off thing with Gordon Ramsay, and it
Mhm.
was pretty funny, but it was just like, like they had like a food truck cook-off between Swedish Chef and Gordon Ramsay, and then that Let's Get Ready to Rumble guy showed up for some reason. It's like, how much? And then there's other like minor celebrities thrown in there. I'm like, how much pop culture can you just sprinkle on here? And I remember learning somewhere recently that Jim Henson, um, being a performance artist, he saw himself that way. Muppets were just one of his many creations and his ideas. And he was
Mhm.
a bit annoyed, as early as like the early 80s, of being like, I'm done with these Muppets. Like, that was a thing I was doing. I want to do something else.
Yeah.
And he feel kind of dragged down by them. But
And
at the
even
time,
like the Dark Crystal,
right, and that was his big separation. That was the
that's
one that, he
and
was like, and everyone's like, this isn't,
right.
Jim Henson
What
stuff.
is
He's like, actually, it is Jim Henson
that?
stuff. Like, this is what I wanted to do. Enough of
Things
this
are
Kermit
weird
the
and
Frog. He was involved with Sesame Street from the early 70s, providing the different characters for that, the puppetry and everything. And by the mid 70s, so John Denver by the mid 70s was sort of sliding down in his career.
Mhm.
Wasn't making, churning out the big hits that he had. The Muppets, on the other hand, were on their way up. And so they were pretty dynamic. The idea of, puppetry on television, and having such,
Vaudeville puppetry. I mean,
yeah, it was, having a talent show type setup.
and that was, I'm thinking of like the Smothers Brothers and things like that. I mean, there was precedent for that at the time, but I
Yeah,
mean, it was very vaudevillian, and just so, what an interesting, strange concept for puppets.
right. Because puppets for a long time, I mean, I'm not expert in the history of puppetry, but I assume as far as performance art, they've been around a really long time, since the first
Absolutely.
person ever did something, on their hand, and I just made a hand gesture on an
Put their
audio,
hand in the sock.
yeah, exactly, probably even before
Lord,
socks.
14.
uh but so they, but to make an entire vaudeville burlesque style, act
Mhm.
with, and then having such different, and I guess I never thought about it as being vaudeville, but Fozzie's the one that really brings it home, with
Sure.
his waka waka and his his scrunched on hat and everything. He looks like he could easily be in slowly I turn step by step,
Just
um
this over the top I mean, I just remember watching Miss Piggy trying to get the towel off of Mikhail Baryshnikov in his
yeah,
song, and just the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life, and just so over the top and so
and,
big.
and I feel like that the Muppets that were, you know the aspect of them that was pulled out of the 70s through the 80s and into the 90s was just the goofy, um quick laugh, because these are puppets, and again, throwing how many celebrities we can put in there
Right.
as possible. Whereas, you know so it should be mentioned that this record came out the same year as the Muppet movie. And
Yes.
so that came out about 3 years after the Muppet Show debuted, which they were on, a big Muppet,
Yeah.
freight train, starting to pick up some speed into the new decade. And um, I think as those movies went on, especially once they got into Muppet Babies, which I loved as a kid,
Mm,
but
me too.
when they started to shed off into those kind of areas, that's when the any kind of like radicalism or edginess that came along in the 70s was starting to disappear. And then the tangent that the Muppets went on after that was just, quick laughs, cheap laughs. Isn't
Sure.
it funny to see humans interacting with these puppets,
Yeah.
and all that? So,
I think that what this record and the Muppet movie and subsequent Muppet movies, but especially the Muppet movie, I think what they have in common too is this real authentic emotional heart that really set it apart from
Yeah.
other um, sort of comedy acts. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into the songs on this, but the songs on this are very sincere. I mean, I think the Muppets' sincerity is something that is really special about them when
Yeah.
they're interacting with each other, um, uh, and the problems that they work through and their relationship with each other. There's something very authentic about it that I think resonates with people as much as the one-liners.
You can tell that, so we were admiring before we started recording the fold out nature of the album, and that you get a panoramic picture of, this big group photo of all the Muppets. You can
Yeah,
tell that so much care was put into each and every one of those
yeah.
characters to, just the right, I think that, maybe not the Muppet or the Jim Henson Company anymore, but puppets have been made before and after the Muppets, and
Mhm.
sometimes just like slap a couple googly eyes onto a sock basically, and you have a puppet. But for each one of these characters, there is, like you said, heart, emotion. There's, there was time put into it. It wasn't just, oh,
Yeah.
we need a band, let's make a band. It was like each one had its own character. And you're right, the songs are, the one, the Carol for a Christmas Tree is a really,
Mhm.
it's Inside All, One of Us. And
Yeah.
there's a couple on here that it's In Every One of Us. That's the
Yeah.
song. um you move ahead 10 years, and there was another Muppet Christmas special that came out, and I didn't really know about this until about 10 years ago. And my wife was like, "Oh, we should watch a Muppet Family Christmas." I'm like, "What's that?" And she told me about it. It's it was just before Jim Henson died, like maybe a year or two before, from 1987. And it's this incredible, just fun story about the Muppets all converging on Fozzie Bear's mom's uh, cat, her farmhouse.
I feel like I've
And
seen that.
all of the Muppets by that point are there. So they eventually, Sesame Street joins the Muppet Show characters, and then later on
Yeah.
the Fraggles show up, and Doc from the Fraggles he was hoping to rent out the house, and so he gets annoyed when all these, as he calls them, weirdos show up, and he's like, "I thought I rented this place," and then by the end of the show, they do a sing along, they do a whole, and they return to some of the songs from this special. So
Nice.
it must have carried some weight with them, and became kind of iconic of, Muppets. And like we were just saying, Muppets equal Christmas. Since 1979, they are, the part, and they kept it going. Then they made, a couple years later, a Muppet Christmas Carol. But I
Yeah.
feel like that's when, that's when they hit that tangent of like, all right, let's find an old story and just throw Muppets into it. Let's
I
do
feel like
Treasure Island, and
yeah, like that. If I were to divide the Muppets into three sort of eras, I think Muppet Christmas Carol sort of begins that second era of, like you said, Muppet Christmas Carol, Muppet Treasure Island, and there was another one, right? And then
but they did I mean, the Muppets from Space is
Muppets
pretty,
from Space. I loved Muppets from
because they
Space.
returned back to, they got,
Absolutely,
it
yeah,
wasn't 100%, but they seemed to go back to, like, let's make an original story instead of just taking old stories and, you
yeah.
know putting Kermit the Frog as, the main character. And they focused on a lesser, followed one in Gonzo. And then um
Oh, and
a
Pepe the
couple,
King Ron is
yeah,
amazing in that movie.
there's so much fun. But the magic of this one seems to have dissipated, and you're never going to get it back. And Jason Segel revived them some years ago when he made the Muppet, the
Right,
Muppets, the movie.
third era.
And you can tell I mean, he was just in love with it. I remember seeing him in Boston. Actually, he was promoting a book, and he was talking about writing the Muppets, and he went to London to do it, because that's where the Jim Henson, studios are there, and that's where they did um, the Muppet Show and everything. And he was saying how it was very, it's almost like, even though they're American, they're almost like very British in their
Mhm.
appearances and stuff, and how and some of that magic returned with his version of the Muppets, but then they went on to make Muppets Most Wanted, and it just kind of, it seemed watered down and just like, all right, we've just, and then
Yeah,
they have like a late night show now again or something. After a while you feel like saying like, maybe you should have taken Jim Henson's lead and just said, all right, we're putting this one away, like the
you
Muppets are
know,
done.
at the risk of being controversial, I will say that since Muppets from Space, the only Muppet movie that to me has really felt like a Muppet movie was the Happy Time Murders, which
Yeah,
is
not a
very
Muppet
adult.
movie.
It's very, very adult. It's Brian Henson. It's in terms of content, it's not very Muppet, but the vibe to me, the edginess,
Mhm.
the heart, the off the wall sort of humor felt very Muppet like to me. It was sort of like coming home again
Yeah,
in a
that's
very
good.
appropriate way.
Well, and that fits pretty well into what we're saying now, because so for each one of these questions that we answer, when we dissect a primary source, you go to the other sentence. What does it tell you about? And I think what it tells us about the late 70s, and it checks out across the board, that there were people in media and entertainment trying new things, and
Mhm.
you had audiences that were increasingly accepting new things. And if maybe 20 years before you said, hey, let's make a whole TV show, a bunch of puppets, or movies made out of puppets, and a Christmas special with a singer, they'd be like, what? Like, maybe Lamb Chop, I don't know, but like, there's much more than that. And there was that edginess to it that really very punk rock, um new wave of like, if you want to try something new, just do it
Mm.
yourself, don't ask other people to do it for you, because if they do it, they'll get it wrong. And what is more punk rock than getting John Denver? That no, but it goes back to, I think it really is symbolic of the time. And then you move ahead, and I'm glad you brought up that the most recent one, the Brian Henson one, is that we've gotten to a point where the Muppets are just so, you know they're on this one plane. And
Yeah.
so you're saying you think he went back to something that would fit in a lot more uh into the 70s, is what you're saying, right?
I mean, for me personally, I think everyone is different. I know that the Jason Segel movies resonated with a lot of people as well. Um, but yeah, for me, that was a film that really took me back. And Muppets from Space did too, as you and I
Yeah,
were talking about.
the Muppet Show was based on two television pilots. One of them was called the Muppets Valentine Show, and the other one was the Muppet Show Sex and Violence, that aired in 1975.
Not
So
know that.
going right back to what you were just saying, though, of
Yeah.
the Happy Time murder. I mean, so when I saw that, I was like, what? Like, but neither of them were picked up in the United States. It was a British producer that put it on the air over there, and then it eventually came back to the United States in syndication, and that's where it started to really make its point, where eventually you get to this. So we narrowed down who likely made it: John Denver and the Muppets. And I think we can be rest assured that, considering what was happening with both of those two in their careers, we were saying before we recorded, that if they had made this, so right now the record, which nobody can see even though I'm holding up to a camera, it says John. It's very nice font. I love the layout here. It's very
Very
simple, very classic and classy.
classic Art Deco sort of font.
Yeah, it has that. And he's wearing his top hat,
Mm.
John Denver is, and it says John Denver and the Muppets. John Denver's on the top line, the Muppets are below him. And I think if this had come out maybe 2-3 years later, definitely the Muppets would have been on the top,
Yeah.
and the human, would be on the bottom. And so that says a lot right there of who made it and what the maker's role or status in society was.
Sure.
That he was, he was still making records and making a lot of them, but you know I'm curious what his perspective on this. Like, do you think he considered this a John Denver record in his discography, or do you think he was just kind of like, yeah, I'll do it, it's another way to stay relevant for a little bit
I
longer?
mean, so he is first, but they are the font is the same size, so it's they do sort of have equal-ish billing. I mean, he's on top. I don't know. I mean, he put out a ton of albums too. I feel like he was very prolific.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to know what was going through his mind. I
Yeah.
also wonder, like, does everyone just feel that they need to do a Christmas album at some point? There you see so many bands and artists that just,
Yeah. And
want to
he
do.
had actually, there was a Christmas album that he did a couple years before this one.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And it obviously is just him. I don't think he, maybe the whole time he's like, man, I could really use a puppet to be here, but
What
to
is
do a
missing?
duet. Um, but whenever I listen to this, and I always felt like he was in the same position as like Dave with Alvin and the Chipmunks,
Mm,
or kind
yeah,
of like a teacherly type, that the Muppets, he was like kind of keeping them in line a little bit, and
yeah,
the way that he sings the songs and stuff, and like kind of, he's like, all right, everybody, just kind of, puts it all together. And I was listening to one of the tracks this morning with my um soon to be 7-year old son, and it occurred to me, I was like, wait a minute, if you just heard this, most of these jokes would fall flat. Like, you wouldn't get it if you didn't know who the Muppets were.
yeah.
And I was like, how would you differentiate between them? And he said, and it was a song that just John Denver was singing. And he's like, I want to hear the Muppets. Why is that just a human? And I said, oh, how can you tell the difference? And he's like, I don't know, I just can. And it's true, because I mean,
Yeah,
imagine how hard that would be to sing as a funny voice to begin with.
yeah.
But
Do
it's
it.
almost like you can tell. But if you had absolutely no context and were listening to any of these songs, like their "Wish You a Merry Christmas" is
Hmm.
hilarious, because Miss Piggy gets in there, Piggy
Right.
pudding, and he's like, "Oh no, I said figgy mood. Piggy. They made it with figs and
And
bacon." Just like, what? Just kind of like. But if you have no idea who the Muppets are,
yeah,
um, or what their voices sound like, they're like, why is that funny that this one character is so incensed that that you said piggy pudding, unless you knew the characters. And so I guess that one of the questions that we can skip ahead to just for a moment anyway, or we can talk about it for a while if you'd like, is who is the intended audience or user of this? And I
mm,
think the obvious intended audience would be fans of the Muppets. That somebody else, you wouldn't give this record to grandma who has never seen the Muppets and knows no idea
right.
what they are, and expect her to enjoy it on the same level as somebody who um, does know them pretty well. So um, that was the intended audience. Like we keep saying, by the late 70s, the Muppets were climbing up as far as being just pop culture giants.
Yeah.
They were very much present. But do you think there was any other reason why it was made in the first place? Why do you think they made it? Do you think it was just to support the movie or the TV show that was about to come out?
I mean, I really don't know. I can see a Christmas special being a logical progression for an entity like the Muppets. We were talking about Garfield earlier. Garfield had a Christmas special. Charlie Brown
Mhm.
had a Christmas special. I mean, it seems like a sort of natural next point in the, I guess, career of of
Yeah.
of entities like that, right? Of pop culture figures. Um, and your point about people it helps if you know who the Muppets are. It helps if you're a fan of the Muppets, and that's probably who this album most was intended to speak to. But everybody knew who John Denver was too. I mean,
Yeah.
you're not going to be, oh, John Denver, who is that? And
So I'm curious if, like I said, about 10 years later is when they made the Muppets only, on they did their own Christmas
mhm.
special on TV without anybody else famous. And I'm curious if when putting this all together, they say, well, we do need to have somebody, you know, well known to
Yeah.
we can't just have a record of puppets. Which I wonder when they recorded this, if the voice actors had their figures on their hands as they were singing. Like I think it would
It
only help
probably help a little,
just to
well,
set
you watch
the
voice actors record and they're always moving around
yeah.
and
And I guess
acting.
impersonators a lot of times will try to, in order to get a good impression, they have to contort their face to look like the person that they're impersonating. So
Yeah.
it's just a funny image of people in a recording studio holding Gonzo and just it's just like kind of limp off to the side, because obviously if you put a microphone up to the Muppets' mouth, you're not going to hear anything other than like clapping. But
The flapping of
yeah,
the
just the
felt,
felt, just
whatever.
hitting the microphone every now and then. And they're like, we got to put your mouth up to the microphone, not the Muppets' mouth.
Like, I'm trying to do the math now because there's this, which was a Christmas special and an album. There was the Muppets Christmas at Home or with Fozzie's mom, whatever that was called. There was also, right, like Rocky Mountain Holiday, but
Yeah,
that was not Christmas, or was it some that was also John Denver, right?
yeah,
I have
that's
very
yeah.
vague memory of this special Rocky Mountain Holiday.
I
And then
think
there
you're
was Emmett Otter, which has the main song in Emmett Otter is one of the songs on this album, is the When the River Meets the Sea.
yeah.
So
It's a
and Christmas Carol. They've done so much Christmas.
the
Really.
70s were a very interesting time for well, because you're right. I think since the beginning of television, the Christmas special has been a staple.
Yeah.
And that and neither of us have seen the TV version. I don't think I ever want to, honestly. I like this the way it is. I like
Yeah.
listening to
Keep
this
the
just
mystery.
kind of there. But I understand that the premise of the Christmas special with what this comes from is them. It's kind of metafictional. They're making a Christmas special, so it's similar to the way the Muppet Show was, where you'd see the behind the scenes stuff of them, like, oh, the act's not here, what are we going to do, and Kermit freaking out, and I think it's along those same lines. And it's interesting because that late 70s time period, I look over, I don't have to look far and anywhere in my house and I find something Star Wars related, and I think about Star
Yeah.
Wars because it's not only did Jim Henson's company eventually partner with Lucasfilm when they made The Empire Strikes Back for Yoda's character, but um George Lucas and those filmmakers of that era were like the renegade independent filmmaker.
Mhm.
And along the same lines of Jim Henson being, it's kind of hard to think of a guy like Jim Henson being renegade, kind of, rebel type guy. But, there was a lot of independent, very artistic people trying new things out that were pushing the boundaries, but then had to conform to the whims of the big corporations that were running the media if they wanted to get any kind of exposure at all. And so I'm curious, I'm assuming the Christmas special, because they made a Star Wars Christmas special around this time
Oh,
too,
they sure did.
and or holiday special. And they really just like you can just kind of picture like the young aspiring filmmaker, puppeteer, musician, whatever, just kind of like, all right, and
Yeah.
the corporate, heads, they're, munching on their cigars, like, the next step, Christmas special. All right, let's put this together. Who do we have available? The John
Yeah.
Denver, and it, kind of taking away from, and so it's very telling of the time period that it was, taking, because I think that the spirit of the 60s produced so many of these kinds of filmmakers and artists, and even TV uh, makers and musicians and everything like that. But then by the 70s, they had nowhere else to turn. There wasn't any internet. There wasn't a big TV was limited to like 5 channels, even in the biggest markets. Cable was so in its infancy, it wasn't even worth mentioning. And like I said before, VHS didn't exist. You couldn't just, you could get a camcorder, but it would cost you so much money. And, to make your own stuff, it wasn't like even 10 years later where you could just get, so you had to go along with whatever the natural progression was in order to get along. And so it's very telling of entertainment in the 70s, for certain. Um, so I don't know if you want to talk about this one at all, if it's going to lead us to much, but where was it made, and or what locations are associated with this source? I don't know if you have it right up there, but as far as recorded at,
Check
let's see.
the album cover here.
Yeah, and that's the natural place to not Wikipedia, but they have the songbook was made in Connecticut, Greenwich, Connecticut is where you could get the songbook from. At least that's where it's distributed from. Um,
John Denver's personal management is out of Beverly Hills.
Yeah, so he's out of Hollywood, and
Recorded.
and people listening to us reading. But
Story time.
I'm assuming that the recording, I know that, like I said, the L Street Studios in London is where the Muppet Show was made. But I'm assuming that, imagine if you were on an airplane and all the Muppets were in there, like they have to buy tickets for each of their seats. Like they're just motionless because they're sitting there, and they're like, oh, they're . Back to New York to record a,
I mean, I am 1,000% certain that they fly on airplanes and like are independently moving around, and
Yeah.
like their mouths are flapping in their seats. And
because there's no other way. If you imagine if they package them up in, into different, not only with the person with the security having to, look at the x-rays and seeing all these Muppets inside of boxes, but imagine if something went wrong and they had to open up one and they saw these like faces looking back at them. So they probably did themselves a favor, and they're like, we're going to make a British, cast, and then we'll make them up over here on the United States side, so we don't ever have that problem. Like every country has its own Muppets, just to so we never have to travel.
Well, they do fly in
I know they,
Paper, which is my favorite Muppet movie.
yes,
but they fly sort of like ninth. I think it's ninth class. They fly ninth class. Just like boxes in the cargo hold, and then they reach England, and they're like, "Yay, the plane's gonna land!" And the flight attendant is just like, "No, the plane doesn't land. And, the plane doesn't stop in England. You get off in England." And they just kind of boot them out the side of the plane.
Well,
but they're just floppy, so they're fine.
Yeah, they're okay. And I always, one of my funniest, I think one of the funniest stunts that they do on that show or any of the versions, when they just throw the puppet, as and you see like their felty arms, like I love when that to me is like classic, Muppet, never gets old, just funny. So the next question is, what ideas or behavior does this convey? And I'm glad that you brought that up about ninth class. And that seems to be something that follows the Muppets all the way through, is that they are kind of meant to be pretty crummy, that they're not, they've never reached the heights of popularity. And, they're just this ragtag group of wannabe entertainers that are trying so hard to. And so in a way, I think there's some ideas of what I was just saying about in that time period of like, we want to be discovered. We want our voices out there, but we're being, from one reason or another, not paid attention to. Are we not good looking enough? Are we not interesting enough? Because you have so many different crazy out there, and each one could easily be a representation of a different segment of society.
Absolutely. And they're all so full of hope, though. They're so buoyant, and they're so charismatic. And even when they're staying in the worst hotel or getting thrown out of the airplane or whatever is happening to them. They just keep going and they keep loving each other,
Yeah,
not
rainbow connection. I mean, they're
rainbow
every
connection.
color of the rainbow, and they don't
Yeah.
they rarely, I mean, I don't want to say rarely, they do among themselves point out, you know, their differences, and sometimes use that as a basis of their, troubles with each other, and
Mhm.
they'll use it as like a, frog, just like, but they seem to show that, how people with such differences can work together and get along. And uh so there's a lot of that, of not to mention, some other ideas that are just kind of embedded in there of family is not necessarily being defined by blood
Yeah.
and by, having the exact same, mom and dad and, the siblings. That you could have a family that is bears and whatever gonzo is and whatever animal is, and, a pig and a frog and, two old men and a dog and whatever Scooter is, and, all these different characters. You can have families that are made up of such, it has more to do with what you get along with than who you're necessarily born around. And I think that's such an important message for any time period, but especially in that era, when, you see divorce rates going up, or people choosing not to have children at all, or if they are, later in life, or, and so there's people trying by the late 1970s, throughout society, there are people just, especially young people, looking for groups to join up with,
Mhm.
to find some kind of belonging. And their families might look a little bit different, or a lot different from previous time periods, or what, was expected of them, but their families nonetheless.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact too on this album where you have John Denver, who has this iconic, beautiful, clear, smooth voice. I mean, he just sings like an angel. And then you have these Muppets that have these sort of rough and tumble voices, or they have, the Kermit voice, or they have,
Yeah.
the Rolf kind of rough voice. And they're not perfect, but they're so perfect together, and they sing with all of their hearts. And I love Frank Oz's Miss Piggy because, I mean, her pitch tends to be kind of terrible, and
Yeah.
but she just goes for it, and it is amazing, and she's an icon. I love that about their musical performances. And I love the Muppet Band. I mean, not just the Electric Mayhem, but the band on the show,
Mhm.
and the other musicians. I mean, they're just so awesome, and so tight. And I love that they surround themselves with that as well.
Only the best for Kermit
Only the
the
best.
Frog. And
But that mixture of voices is really great because maybe we can't all sing like John Denver, but maybe some of us can sing like, Rolf or Kermit or Floyd or Piggy or something.
you can find your own. What are your favorite songs off this album? Which are the ones that,
Oh my God.
um
Well, I can tell you my favorite moment is in Little Saint Nick. And I love the Beach Boys version of that song as well,
yeah.
but I think the Electric Mayhem version is the best. But in the sort of outro of Little Saint Nick, there's this repeated like ooh where they're oohing over and over again. And there's
Yeah.
this one time when they do it, an animal pops in and he's late and he's just like, oh, and it just cracks me up every time. I just die
They're the
laughing.
kings of that self-aware comedy. Like, they knew. And it's almost like, not only did the voice actors and the puppeteers know it, but they channel that through their characters so well.
Yeah.
that they know how ridiculous they are, and they make fun of themselves so perfectly like that, because that's obviously intentional. They were like, let's throw that in there for a good laugh, and it,
Yeah,
stuck all this time.
totally.
That's awesome. And
But I love the beautiful songs on here too. It's in Every One of Us. I mean, is so gorgeous. And When the River Meets the Sea is so gorgeous. One
they
of those
and
is Paul Williams, right? Who
I think so.
I
I mean,
think
I'll
it's
take your word for it. As far
um
as I
who
think we're
is
both.
famous for, for all of their music, but When the River Meets the Sea is Paul Williams. I just looked it up. That might be cheating. But he's famous for Rainbow Connection and all of that. But
Such a good collaboration, and
absolutely.
and Jim Henson wasn't, he wouldn't hesitate to just hand off things to talented, I'm not a songwriter, I'm gonna
Mm,
give this musical, because this musical act, to musicians, and I'm just kind of, so very performance art-ish. It's not as straightforward as I think a lot of people think it is, that it's just
mhm.
like, oh, here's puppets doing silly things. It's like, no, it's a collaboration of a lot of talent in different
Yeah.
corners of it. I always looked forward to, I loved Christmas is Coming.
Oh
uh
my gosh.
that was
Yes.
my first introduction to the round, which
Yeah.
I used to love doing in music class when I was a kid. When we got to do a round, like, okay, now you start, and do
Yeah.
that. And I used to love that one, and I love the 12 Days of Christmas. We were listening to that one last night, and I love it for Miss Piggy's five cold. And I always misjudge when she adds
Yeah.
in the little flair to it. The bum bum bum. I always misjudge it. It's like, no, it's not until like they get to day 11 that she actually does it, and then by the end they all join her. And I always love that one. But my wife was pointing out to me, she said, "Isn't there a part where Fozzie makes a mistake and forgets his line for the seventh day?" Because it's not on this version, and that comes from the TV show.
Oh,
So,
I don't
and I
remember
think
that.
that kind of joke would have worked a lot better for a visual
Right.
version. It wouldn't work so well, if you're listening to it, because it's the first song off the album. So you're like, wait, why is it
Why
like,
is there a mistake in
why
there?
did they record somebody not prepared for this? That's so silly. So there are
One
two
take.
versions of it, at least
Get it.
that, and there's a couple songs on here that were not part of the Christmas special. But just, I mean, I was mentioned before, whenever I hear these songs, I picture them in the same um appearance as the album, the black background. I don't picture them in the still images that I've seen from the TV, and I don't want to see it that way. I want to keep
Yeah.
it just as it is. So the last question um is this prescriptive or descriptive? And there's so many ways to look at that. I think, as far as, so that the words on here, the explanation of what songs are on here and the production information, I mean, that's all descriptive.
Mm,
You know, but the rest of it, from the cover art to the inside art, um, and the songs themselves, those are very prescriptive. And also the fact that, so when you opened up, what happened when you opened up your record this evening?
When I opened my record this evening, a CD fell out and I picked it up and it was the same album. It was this album on CD
The
that had been tucked
past,
inside the
past
record.
Audie must have said, I'm going to put this here.
I know where to.
And so I don't think there was an 8-track version of this. There probably was a cassette version, but I would guess probably it was homemade. That this was made for record, is made on vinyl. And so that tells me that the maker of it was not intending for people to drive around listening to this music,
Right.
which might speak to the energy crisis at the time, because there weren't any lights to look at. But I digress. But there was, the idea of, because when we were listening to some tracks off this, it was on my Spotify Christmas list that I made for myself, and we were driving around looking at lights last night, um as we do all the time, listening to Christmas music.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, that's clearly not what this was intended for. It was prescribed by being in a giant record form, because records do not do very well in cars.
They do not.
to be on your turntable
Yep.
while you were doing things like you and I were talking about at the beginning of this, that
Yeah.
it's meant to be the background, and I would definitely, I appreciate it for that because I like the fun songs and I would look, those are the ones as a kid I would look forward to, but you can't skip around on a record the same way you can a CD.
You can't, and it has the two sides, and they have, there's a pause. It's like an intermission.
Yeah.
It's a whole experience, the record, and it needs to be listened to in order, in my opinion.
Yeah, and they put the songs in the order that they do for a reason,
Yeah.
as any good, and that was for the 70s. I mean, they've been doing that for a solid 15 years by that point. You mentioned the Beach Boys before. I mean, they were the ones that actually created the album as we know it with Pet Sounds, where instead of just here's a bunch of songs, and they did that for a long time too. Like, here's a bunch of songs we recorded, we'll throw them in thematically. By 19, what was it, 66, 67, when they did Pet Sounds, it was no, we're recording all these songs for a particular album. That's why it begins a certain way. It segues from one song to the next, and it ends the way that it does because it's all, meant, it's prescribed. This is how you're going to listen to this music. Like, you
Hmm.
could listen to the singles all you wanted, but if you're going to listen to it on record, you're going to listen all the way through and not skip around. And so this is the same way. This album is more about, so your CD version enters a whole new era of listening to this because then you can skip around with ease
Yeah.
and just listen to, you're like, "Oh, I don't really feel like listening to Alfie the Christmas Tree story. I want to hear, their version of, We Wish You a Merry Christmas. I'll just skip to the end. There's no reason
Yeah.
to. So it's, I think what that tells us about, the 70s is that, for listening audiences, they'd gotten used to it by now. By the end of the 70s, it was like, no, the artist wants us to listen to this
Mhm.
in a particular way. It's like, you're an author, so it'd be weird if you were like, yeah, you can start on page 67. I don't care.
Start anywhere.
Like, just pick up.
Well, it's interesting because we've gotten so far away from that again, with sort of songs existing kind of on their own and not within context, in a lot of places, like you mentioned, Spotify and things like that. And I mean, I remember as a kid not I mean, as a little kid, like, not knowing that you didn't have to listen, like, you could fast forward a tape.
Yeah.
Like, I remember buying or somehow getting my hands on do you remember the song from Neverending Story that was
Oh
like a
yeah.
huge hit for this artist called Limahl, who
Hmm.
had the hair that you're picturing? And I had that cassette, and my God, I would listen to that whole tape to get to the Never-Ending Story. Like, that was the experience, and a
Because
lot of
only
the
advanced tape players had the ability to read, because there were some tape players that you could put it on, that there was a marker that had like the fast forward
oh,
symbol
yeah.
with a line, vertical line at the end of it, so it could sense breaks between songs and would stop every, but
Yeah.
those were only advanced tape decks. You couldn't really find that.
I mean, we had the technology. You could fast forward, but it was not in that mindset. I remember as a kid sitting on a stool in the kitchen, listening to Thriller and just repeatedly listening to the whole album,
Mhm. Well, because you
Whatever.
don't want to just, if you're looking for a particular song, you don't want to fast forward and then end up 10 seconds into it,
Right?
because it's really not the same thing if you just get, I mean, I have so much trouble if I come into a store and it's like midway through a song, or if I kind of hear it in the background, I'm
Hmm.
like the tempo is all off. I'm totally lost. I'm like, where? Oh, this is Blue Christmas. Like, it's like it takes me a minute. And so if you're fast forwarding through music, you always are on that risk of ending up somewhere. You're supposed to hear the song from beginning to end. You're not supposed to hear just a little clip.
Here.
And so that's why you have to power through some of the things you don't necessarily want in order to get an actual thing. So I mean, I think people listened a lot more closely to records,
I
in
think
the
that
age
they
of
did.
records.
I taught music for a long time in elementary schools, and one of the things that we had to practice was listening. And not in the sense of, listen to the teacher, but like listening to music. And we would start with 10 seconds. And, it was, what does it mean to listen? It means your focus is not on someone else. You're not, communicating in another way. You're not thinking about this. You're just sort of in this moment with this sound. And I'm not saying that you need to listen to every album like that, but it, certainly it's nice to just have music on in the background too. But I do think it's a skill that gets better with practice, and we don't practice necessarily as much as we used to. When I was a kid, my dad used to play Beethoven records for me in the dark in a room.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to do but sit there in the dark and listen to Beethoven. And it was
you don't
awesome.
need to see anything. I mean,
You don't need to see anything. There's nothing going on. It's all in your ears.
And maybe this particular record that we've been talking about is a good starter for that, because I wouldn't be surprised if that's why they in part did the record as they did, with this black background of just in the still that very still of the night kind of feel of it, and just kind of like, yeah, this is the only thing that we have, so don't distract yourself with anything else. You're going to have a chance just to listen to the music closely, and if you listen close enough, you can hear the felt of their lips,
clapping.
Yeah. But no,
all of Christmas is in there.
Yeah, you don't need anything else.
You don't need it.
But it is so perfect. And I really, really appreciate how much time. I'm glad we decided to do this one. I mean, we'll get to Garfield soon, but
we're not visual right now, but there is a wall of Garfields behind me, and they're ready for their time in the sun.
He has been. I think Garfield has been overlooked, but I can't wait to talk about him, because I was all week long, I was like, I'm going to talk about Garfield. And then it hit me yesterday. I'm like, hey, let's get to the Muppets, because it's Christmas time. And, there's nothing that says Christmas like John Denver and the Muppets, A Christmas Together. So
totally agree.
Thank you so much, Audie, for joining today for the EPS podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, and I want to just put this on the record player right now and listen to the whole thing.
Me too. I'll have to double check the copyright of it if I want to include any parts on the beginning or the end of the actual podcast intro.
Like 1 second.
Yeah, I'll get away with that one, because they're owned by Disney now, so I don't want to mess.
Right, you don't want to mess with that.
Right, I might have somebody knocking on my door within a few minutes if I go too long on it. But thanks for joining the EPS podcast, for everything, including the John Denver and the Muppets, A Christmas Together record, is a primary source. And we'll see you next time.